but they ain't rich like me. You can't call yourself loaded till you can buy an army. Ran wrong with Pompey and Caesar, they're more famous than me. But I'm the world's richest geezer, there's no one richer than me.
This shit's not gonna be strong enough. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Drunk History with Graf. This is a series in which I drink some alcohol and talk about history, starting from the Bronze Age, going all the way up to the present day. In the last episode, we talked about Sulla's civil war and the Marian reforms, two of the main things that led to what will happen in this and the next episodes. So today, we're going to talk about the first Triumvirate. So, before we actually go and talk about the Triumveres in question, there's actually something that I forgot to mention in the previous episode, which was the Social War, which starts in 91 BC. And essentially what the Social War was it was a revolt by the Socii, or Italian allies of Rome. Now, when Rome had conquered the rest of Peninsular Italy in, I think it was the 5th episode, can't quite remember, the rest of Italy found itself under Roman domination, and contributing massively to Rome's military and economy. Despite this, the Socii did not enjoy much in the way of privilege in the Roman world, compared to the Romans and Latins, who enjoyed massive privilege, as mentioned in the previous episode. Though the Romans did end up winning this war, they also ended up making a lot of concessions to the Italian allies. An example being that if you were a part of this revolt, if you presented yourself before a Roman praetor within 60 days, then you would be granted Roman citizenship. It should be noted though that this happened right before the First Mithridatic War, and Sulla was one of the big participants on the Roman side. And a lot of the troops who followed him to Anatolia and then back to Rome had been participants in the war under Sulla. Right, now into the meat of what we're going to talk about today. The First Triumvirate. So in the last few episodes, we've had a look at how Roman society was generally just sort of degenerating, how corruption was becoming more rife, and how the ordinary functions of government could easily be subverted. Well, 3 influential Romans realized this and decided to take advantage of it. These were Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. And for the rest of this episode, we're going to be looking at the first part of their lives, leading up to them joining the Triumvirate. And we're going to go in order of importance at the time. So, the first of these is Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Pompeius, or as he's more commonly known in English, simply Pompey, which is how I'm going to refer to him for the rest of this segment, was a wealthy Roman whose career really started when the First Mithridatic War turned ugly and became Sulla's civil war. Pompey found himself generally to be on the side of Sulla, and so when Marius came in and stormed the city, Pompey found himself on one of Marius's lists and was forced to flee the city, where he went to Iberia. Iberia at this time was caught up in the midst of the Sertorian revolt, which meant the Republican authority in the province had almost entirely broken down. So what Pompey ended up doing was assembling an army out of Iberian Romans, and then going to reinforce Sulla. So when Sulla marched on Rome for the second time, he brought with him a small part of his army under the command of Pompey. Most infamously, at the Battle of the Colline Gate outside the walls of Rome, when Sulla appeared to be losing the battle, the right flank of the battle, which was commanded by Pompey, had crushed the Marians, leading Sulla to win the battle. And this resulted in Pompey being given the title Magnus, or the Great. After Sulla took Rome, Pompey would be essentially his lapdog, going around and clearing up revolts across the empire, including in Africa, and then returning to Iberia to clear up Sertorius' revolt. In 73 BC, the Third Servile War broke out, which was, as previously mentioned on this show, a massive slave revolt led by a Thracian slave called Spartacus. In 71 BC, Pompey was brought into Italy to go and back up Crassus. Despite the fact that Crassus seemed to be winning, Pompey joined in the battle, and ended up being given the credit for winning. Crassus would remember this. Pompey would use the influence gained in crushing the Sertorian revolt and the slave revolt to push for being elected consul. This was actually very illegal, as not only was he 35, which is far too young to be able to hold this office, he had also not climbed up the Cursus Honorum, which was the hierarchy of Roman political ranks that you had to go through, with each rank leading on to the next. These ranks being Quaestor, Aedile, Praetor, and Consul. But Pompey decided he was just going to skip straight to Consul. Not too long after this, the Third Mithridatic War happened, and yeah, we're going to basically skip over the second one, because the second and third, basically exactly the same repeats of the first, except without the, Roman civil war halfway through. In this war against Pontus, Pompey would be extremely successful, pushing Mithridates back to here, and this is the first time in which the borders of Rome coincided with the borders of Parthia. There were fears that the Parthians might intervene on behalf of Pontus, but Pompey went and negotiated with them to remain neutral. Another state in the area was not quite so politically savvy, this being the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid Empire decided that they were going to throw their lot in with Mithridates. They would soon come to regret this, as Pompey came down on them like a ton of bricks, and very quickly the Seleucid Empire permanently ceased to be. In the meantime, he was also arbitrating disputes in Judea, where a civil war was going on between two separate factions. Pompey ended up siding with the faction led by the father of the infamous King Herod. After all this, Pompey would push north and again take the fight to Mithridates. After losing almost all of his territory, Mithridates ended up committing suicide. Being unable to poison himself because he made himself immune to poisons, he ended up having to get his slave to stab him. And this is the point that Pompey was at when he joined the Triumvirate. Now before I go into any more detail about the Triumvirate itself, I'm going to go and now move on to Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus, much like Pompey, was a pro-Sullan during the Civil War. Unlike Pompey, however, Crassus was a pleb, which means he did not have a title of nobility. His family was, however, rather wealthy. But when Marius descended on Rome, all of Crassus's property was confiscated, forcing him to flee. Once again, when Sulla marched on Rome for the second time, Crassus came with him. However, Crassus had actually learned from Marius. Realizing that under Marius, his property had all been confiscated and sold for really low amounts of money, specifically for political reasons, he came up with a fantastic scheme. When Sulla purged supporters of Marius, he would also sell their land for rock-bottom prices. Crassus came up with the fantastic idea of buying up all of this land at really low price and becoming essentially Rome's landlord. See, at the beginning of this, Crassus was essentially broke, and he really wanted to rebuild his family fortune as they had been quite wealthy before this. Even after Sulla was gone, he came up with another infamous scheme to net himself even more control of the Roman real estate market. He invested in a crew of slaves, who he quickly trained to be firefighters. And he began a scheme where he would look out for houses that caught fire, and he would find these houses that caught fire, and then he would, instead of putting the fire out immediately, he would offer to buy the house while it was still on fire for considerably lower costs, once again, because if it's on fire, it's obviously worth less. Then he would put out the fire once he had bought the house, and then charge the previous owner of the house rent. If the owner refused to sell, then he would not put out the fire, and he would wait for the house to burn down, at which point he would then buy the land that the house was on, once again, for extremely low price. This made Crassus essentially the landlord of most of Rome, and netted him a huge amount of money. So when the Third Servile War came, he decided to cash this money in, start up an army, and go and defeat the slaves. Initially, this army did extremely poorly, having extremely poor morale, so he decided to revive the old Roman disciplinary punishment of decimation, or decimation. Every contubernium, or squad of 10 Roman soldiers, would be provided with a glass jar of 10 beans, 9 black ones and 1 white one. Each of the Romans would pull a bean, and whoever had the odd bean out would then be beaten to death with clubs by the other people in the contubernium. Needless to say, after this, there was little dissent. and little running away. Crassus pursued Spartacus down the Italian peninsula, eventually crushing him at the Battle of Cilarius River. Before this happened, however, Crassus was backed up by none other than Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. And despite Crassus essentially winning the war with his privately funded army, Pompey was given a triumph for it. Crassus did not object to this, but he secretly was very resentful of Pompey. After this, they both ended up running for consul in 70 BC, and both being elected. They both wanted to remain in power, but in Rome you couldn't run for consul 1 year after another. So they came up with an idea. They needed a puppet and a figurehead. So instead, they brought in Gaius Julius Caesar. In English, it's fairly common to refer to him as Julius Caesar, but I'm going to call him Julius Caesar. So, suck it, Dovati, I have the balls to call him by his real name, regardless of what my audience thinks. Caesar came from the patrician class, which was the noble class of Rome. However, he was not a particularly wealthy one. He was from one of the oldest families in Rome, tracing his lineage back to those who settled Rome from Alba Longa when asked to by Romulus. Unlike Crassus and Pompeius, Caesar and his family were pro-Marius in the Sullan Civil War. In fact, Gaius Marius actually married Caesar's aunt, which demonstrates how comparatively close they were, which put him under a lot of suspicion from Sulla. So after Sulla marched on Rome for the second time, he fled into the provinces. And just to make this worse, Caesar also married a woman called Cornelia, who was also the daughter of a prominent Marian faction politician called Cinna. Even after Sulla stepped down from his dictatorship, Caesar did not feel safe in Rome, so he ended up joining the army and being sent on a diplomatic mission to Bithynia. This was primarily to secure an alliance with Bithynia to ensure the support of the Bithynian navy. However, because Caesar did not want to go back to Rome straight away out of fear of Sulla, rumors ended up eventually circulating about Caesar being in a homosexual relationship with the king of Bithynia. That likely never happened, but it was very funny to imagine. In 78 BC, when Sulla finally died, Caesar decided to finally get back to Rome. However, on his way back to Rome, he was captured and imprisoned by pirates. The pirates attempted to ransom him back to Rome for a price of 20 talents of silver. Hearing this, Caesar came up with a fantastic idea, because like Crassus, he was broke after having the entirety of his family's fortune confiscated. So Caesar confronted the pirates and told him that he was insulted that they would ask so little. Did they not know who he was? And instead, he demanded that they instead up the payment necessary to get him back to 50 talents of silver. The somewhat perplexed pirates did this, all the while continuing to have Caesar in their custody. He joked with them. Apparently he played songs and wrote poems, all the while joking that he was going to crucify the lot of them. As soon as he got back to Rome, he scraped together a small army and went off to Cilicia, where the pirates were based, and crucified the lot of them, and took back the 50 talents. In 63 BC, Caesar ran for the position of Pontifex Maximus, and if you've heard that title before, you might be a Catholic, as that is the title that is also given to the Pope. But really, it's a title in Latin meaning high priest. It's the highest religious authority in the city of Rome. And back before Christianity, this would be the highest priest, just generally. Highest spiritual and religious authority in the city. Now, this might sound silly, given what Caesar has been doing recently, but it should be noted that before he had his shit confiscated, he was actually a high priest of Jupiter. So this was not actually anything new for him. In 60 BC, he meets up with Pompeius and Crassus, creating the first Triumvirate, because Pompeius and Crassus need someone to roll in the Senate and push through all of their agendas, and Caesar needs money. So you might have noticed that I said that I was going to be doing these in order of the most important, and that went Pompeius, Crassus, and then Caesar, You're probably somewhat perplexed at this, given how important Caesar is to history, but it should be noted that he really was the junior partner in all of this. Caesar was the public face, Crassus was the moneybags, and Pompey was the muscle. Having said that though, it should be noted that Caesar was actually going through a massive midlife crisis at this point. While in Bithynia, he allegedly found a statue of Alexander the Great and started crying, realizing that he was about the same age as Alexander, having done practically fuck all with his life. It's hard to imagine that. Julius Caesar, what am I doing with my life? Now, I also actually have to take a moment to look at Crassus as well, because although historians generally refer to Crassus as being the money behind the First Triumvirate, it should be noted that he was not nearly as wealthy as he's generally portrayed in popular media. He had most likely got the most amount of money that anybody in Rome had got through legitimate business. But that isn't saying much. See, in Rome, you didn't get money from being a businessman. Hell, you didn't even get money for being a landowner. You got money for being a politician and a general. Because when you campaigned, once you became consul, once you had finished your term as consul, you would be provided with a province to govern, and that province would be yours to exploit. And that is how the wealthy Romans of the day became wealthy. At this point, Pompey had essentially his own miniature empire in the east, in Anatolia and in Syria. And when he really needed money, he could pull on those, and he could eventually pull a lot more money than Crassus did. But at the time, without pulling on this miniature empire, Crassus would be the wealthiest. It should also be noted that this is why Sulla was relieved of his position by Marius. What Marius wanted was he wanted the position of consul so that he could conquer the east and then get it as a cash cow once his term as consul was over. So now, with the First Triumvirate formed, these three essentially make a pact to support each other politically. This is a pretty strained relationship, as Crassus and Pompey dislike each other on a personal level, Caesar is poor, and they would frequently be away from Rome for periods of time, but they would always be working towards each other's common interest. It should be noted that a lot of people like to think of the First Triumvirate, and of Caesar in particular, as being some sort of pro-plebeian ideologue, so they were trying to support the people against the corrupt elites of the Senate, but really they were all looking out for their own personal interests. Now for Caesar, this was securing his nobilitas, his legacy in a sense. For Pompey, it was securing his continued political power, and for Crassus, it would be more money. The ideology of populism that they would put forth was basically means to an end. By getting the people on their side, Caesar could shift the balance of power in favour of the Triumvirate. In 59 BC, Caesar became consul, alongside another politician called Marcus Bibulus. However, Caesar would quickly sideline Bibulus, pushing him out of politics, ignoring his policies and suggestions, and essentially it became a single-person consulship before long. Some satirists even referred to this as the dual consulships of Julius and Caesar. While in the consulship, Caesar would push for the same redistribution of land laws that had been supported by people like the Gracchi brothers. And to ensure that he would not have his body dumped in the Tiber with the rest of them, he leveraged Pompey and his army to put a bunch of soldiers in the city to generally threaten senators and mobs alike to stop them from doing this. So you can see just the absolute state of the Republic, that three dudes coming together can pretty much just take over the entire state and subvert the normal runnings of the Constitution. At this point, the Republic is basically dead. It's just a corrupt mess at this point. And now, seeing the absolute state of the Republic, I'm going to end it here, and we're going to continue about the second half of the Triumvirate's lives in the next episode. So, at the end of this episode, the map looks like this. Pontus has been destroyed, the Seleucid Empire has been destroyed, the Jews have their own kingdom that I completely neglected to mention the origin of, but I'll talk about that later. and the Republic is a fucking mess. In the next episode, we're going to talk about Crassus's abject failures of militaryship, Caesar's abject successes in militaryship, and Pompey's politics, I guess. This has been Graf. I will see you guys then. Thank you very much.